Alright, hello everybody. My name is Cody Zimmerman. This is for my systematic theology class at Urshan Graduate School of Theology. The date is 8 November 2017. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about the abilities of the apostolic hermeneutic. Now, to define apostolic, we have to look at simply the first century church, and it's a calling back to that first century church, the ideals that were associated with it, the principles and the ethics in which they carried out in their day-to-day lives. Hermeneutic is a term that will be applied to in this particular instance as the way that the individual or the group will look at a scripture or a section of scripture and interpret that in their modern lives. Now, when you look at the way that this can happen, there's a lot of different influences that play a part of this. So some of these can be in just forming this circle as the text itself, the contextualization of the text, the principle derived from it, and then the application that has on our lives today. Just as a little side note, I think it's important to note here that the apostolic church and the Pentecostal church, that apostolic does not mean Pentecostal, that they are two different terms. And I think that that's something that some people may not fully understand. So when we look at this, is another example of how people understand the Bible. You understand it as the scripture that's written down, the interpreter or the preacher or the teacher, whoever's happening to read it, and then the student or the learner that's actually in the class. Now, some of the things that many apostolics agree on as far as hermeneutic is the idea of the covenant that extends from Genesis to Revelation, from God to Adam, all the way through to the book of Revelation, that every new covenant is just a renewing of that original covenant. Now, this bleeds into the ideal that we do not separate the Old and the New Testament, that we view it all as one continuous scripture, that the Old Testament is weighted just as important as the New Testament is. This is particularly relevant when looking at the fact that the apostolics, that the apostles were all Jews. Which this ideal helps us to build apostolic theology, apostolic thought process, and importantly to note here, the apostolic hermeneutic. The way that we look at the first century scripture and try and interpret that into our modern lives. One of the things that goes along with this is the idea of removing church traditions. Now, church traditions can be good, but they can also remove from scripture. When you add in 2,000 years, it's obvious that you're going to walk from what the original intent of Scripture was. So this is just a call back to that. To keep the teaching of the original apostles, the original 12 apostles and Jesus Christ, who walked the earth, who taught these lessons, who spoke these things, to be able to understand that, to be able to realize that and relate it to our modern world is critical for the apostolic hermeneutic. Some of the books in the New Testament that we put extremely heavy emphasis on is the book of Acts and the book of Romans. Now, when we look at these books, we see the foundation of the early church. We see the early walk of some of the apostles. So we see how it's critical to understand that. And then to be able to take that and understand that the Bible has a practical application to our lives today. That we have to be able to take the lessons from these first century people in a Jewish culture and be able to apply them to our 21st century. Now, when we look at Old Testament scripture and Jewish tradition, we find very quickly Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And when we look at this, it's something that bleeds heavily into our apostolic ideals. Now, another way to identify our kind of hermeneutic is to look at the Wesleyan quadrilateral. So you see the scripture that influences our hermeneutic, and the text and the context that are found therein influence what we believe and how we believe it. tradition, ancient tradition, and modern tradition. Oh, excuse me. Ancient tradition and modern tradition are going to influence the way that we believe, the way that we perceive the world around us, and influence how we act in a certain situation. Now, when working with tradition, we quickly find ourselves also dealing with reason, the rationale and understanding of the text. And we as apostolics have the ability to adapt our tradition to better fit the first century church if it's seen proper and appropriate. And this will in turn affect our experience, affect our walk with God, and affect our personal testimony, which is one of the greatest attributes and tools that the modern day apostolic has at their disposal to be able to change the world around them. Now, the church has the responsibility to apply the text to the modern world in everything that we do. And by doing so, we have to be able to look at not only the good but also the bad situations that we encounter, figure out the scripture, and then be able to modify, not the scripture, but modify our mindset to better appropriate that. Now, looking into the summary of what we've talked about here today, it's very briefly the ideals of the apostolic hermeneutic affecting the modern day world by applying a first century lens to our walk with God.